Well, you lead.
Welcome to Martin Stephen Pelleneroth Taylor show, Capitals Uncovered, with John Helmer, Australian by origin, long-time Moscow correspondent. And last time you were on, John, you pointed out that the globe behind me was focused on Australia. And I've actually moved it a little bit so that it covers more of the Pacific. And I spent a couple of minutes looking at the globe, and as one does, and I'm surprised by a couple of things, by like how large Indonesia is. We know this, but because it's in the equator, it's shrunk on the Mercator projection. And also the thing that struck me, I went around measuring with my fingers how close to the North Pole I am. In other words, so when the Brits casually and arrogantly say, "Oh, you're up there in the North Pole," they're almost right actually, because it's like this much space on the globe. It doesn't take long, and then if you place those fingers and you place it somewhere in the Pacific, you're hardly moving. I mean, it completely vanishes in the Pacific or in the Indian Ocean or in the South Atlantic or in Africa. So, I mean, a lot of our civilization is clustered very far north, especially in Scandinavia. So it's not far. I don't know, you guys, because we're talking about geopolitics, it's a light-hearted banter we're having here, but is there anything that strikes you guys when you look at a globe, Martin?
The vastness of Africa. Every time, Pele, that always strikes me compared with Europe. And it has its impact on modern history because Western Europe had this leading advance in industrialized civilization. They were able to impose their will on very temporarily on gigantic areas of the globe across South America, across Southern Asia, but most of all across Africa. I think we always underestimate simply how vast Africa is. And of course, you're right about Indonesia. I'm sure you traveled much more than I have, John, but I traveled quite a bit there 25 years ago when I was covering the transition to democracy under President Megawati after Suharto fell. A very dramatic and at the time very encouraging time. And I was very impressed by the people of the archipelago, especially of Java and in the city of Jakarta. But it made me realize how much we overlook the vastness and significance and immense contributions in the world of the peoples of Indonesia. And they do cover a vast area. And we tend to I don't think people in Australia do for all the obvious reasons. But in the Northern Hemisphere, I think we're totally oblivious to it.
We are. And well, what strikes you, John? Well, one thing about the Southern Hemisphere is that if there's a nuclear war, you want to be in New Zealand. I mean, we know these things, but it's when you see it on a globe and you see that a country with an almost English climate perched on the Pacific North Sea, which cleanses all nuclear clouds, as it were. It's a place to be. Sorry, yeah.
No. Growing up at the bottom end of the world, and I'm always surprised that people think the world is a globe. If you grew up in Australia, you understood the world's flat, and that Australia's on the other side of it.
That's right.
It's not a globe at all. The second part is that growing up in Australia, I regarded as her heroes those principally British explorers who failed to make it to the South Pole. Captain Robert Falcon Scott and is the most famous of those who died in the attempt and was beaten by the Norwegians, who survived, but who are outside of Norway forgotten, whereas the Scot who didn't survive will be remembered forever. And no, I, from an Australian point of view, growing up, and certainly in the history of recent Australian governments, Indonesia's a problem. Indonesia was an enemy state which murdered Australian journalists who dared to investigate their crimes in Timor and in Papua New Guinea. And I paid very little attention since I moved to the United States and then to Europe, Greece, and then to to Russia, how things have changed in Indonesia.
Is there I just say a thing about, well, two questions. One is that do the Australians now have, when they have their maps and their, your foreign ministry, does it focus on the Pacific and we have Australia at the center, or do you still have Australia in the bottom right hand corner? And often on these world maps, they're like two New Zealands. And I think when I was a child, I thought there literally were two New Zealands because the map goes more than 360 degrees.
Right. Yeah. I'd have to say I don't know what goes through Australian map making minds, and certainly not what goes through Canberra's political minds. They're extremely busy, pardon me, trying now to comply with President Trump's ambitions to curtail and fight China. And that's right. So I'm afraid Australia is not one of those countries I know much about any longer. Yeah.
I wanted to, well, we'll head on to your area of expertise, obviously, in a second. But I just want to say one thing is that, I've studied a lot about the assassination of Olof Palme. And I was reading up on Gough Whitlam, and he was like an Australian equivalent of Olof Palme, which was a guy who challenged the Australian deep state and its the American clients, and a bit like Harold Wilson as well. And he was toppled in very suspicious manner, wasn't he? And is he regarded as a hero in Australia, or what? Or is he?
Well, that's a controversial point. I was on Whitlam's staff during that short-lived government. It was the 50th anniversary of the overthrow of the Whitlam government in November of last year. An overthrow in which Jimmy Carter sent Warren Christopher, then a Deputy Secretary of State, to Whitlam, then in retirement, to apologize and say that the CIA would no longer topple Australian governments. This was surprised Whitlam, and there's a good record of that particular meeting. There's a very good reason for it. The CIA no longer needs to promise an Australian official whom the agency has toppled, because the CIA and the United States government has so thoroughly penetrated the Australian Labor Party government and all significant political opposition in the country, so thoroughly penetrated that the successes for Whitlam didn't need to be toppled. They were already under control. And that was particularly true of Robert Hawke, another Labor Prime Minister, who followed. So Australia celebrated the Whitlam overthrow, but doesn't regard him as a hero. No. And the Labor Party governments of the present don't want to be reminded of the policies of that time, which were first to end the Australian involvement in the Vietnam War. Well, nowadays, the Australian Labor government participates in whatever war the United States wants it to engage in, whether it was Afghanistan or Syria or Iraq. And now very clearly they're engaged in the war against Russia in the Ukraine. So Australia is simply a transformed country. And the very brief period of Labor government under Whitlam, 72 to 75, was a story of the very last attempt at a government that tried to make Australia national and independent. And it failed. And it's still failing.
What do you yeah.
Cold comfort for you, John. But compared with Indonesia, Australia at least got off lightly, because in Australia in 1966, in order to make sure that any potential communist threat of which they were paranoid was eliminated, the agency, in the time of that great champion of democratic values around the world, Lyndon Johnson, activated a full-scale genocide of the entire 1 million strong Chinese community in Indonesia. It was one of the great modern war crimes. And outside Indonesia, it remains utterly unknown. And it had a traumatic effect on people in Indonesia. And insofar as it was known at all, the crime had the cover of subconscious racism from liberals as well as conservatives outside Indonesia, because the assumption was simply, well, they can't do democracy the way we white Europeans and we white British can, and even the way these polite Japanese have been taught to by the atom bombings and power bombings of Tokyo. They behaved themselves since. And of course, the Japanese made great transistor radios and later great cars. So there was honored the Western identification, even then, for Japan, but not for the poor people of Indonesia. And instead, it's a double whammy. Not only is the military activated to carry out this monstrous war crime and activate fascist and racist groups all across Java and all across the entire archipelago, but the entire people of Indonesia who never voted for this, who did not participate in this, are stained with the blood. And it was a monstrous issue. As I say, 1 million people. And it remains to this day a very dark hole. The irony, of course, is today the Indonesian government, while very much in America's orbit, is also terrified of Beijing. And the one thing they desperately do not want to do is to reawaken in Beijing any memories or curiosities about the crimes of 1965, 1966.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that, Martin. Yes, it's best to remember that the Australian government now comes extremely close in its support of Israel and the United States in endorsing genocide in Gaza. There are 1 million Muslim people of Australian nationality. There are about 120,000 Jews of Australian nationality, and the latter group have succeeded, much as is going on in the United States, to criminalize all forms of criticism of Israel, of the Gaza genocide, the destruction of the West Bank, the destruction of Lebanon that's ongoing today. So Australia, as a government, has sided with first the British so-called emergency or anti-insurgency campaign known as the emergency in Malaya, and then endorsed the genocidal destruction of the Chinese population in Indonesia. Yes, they've done all that. And they will continue to support that in their view of geopolitics.
I honestly want to say we can move over to Russia, but I'd say one last thing is that I did a lot of research and wrote a book about World War One, and I was struck by how, well, not struck, it's not surprising because it was World War One, and Britain and Australia and Canada had only recently got their independence, but how completely loyal they were to the British and not questioning. Well, that's one thing.
Not quite. The Irish population were not loyal.
No,
they were regarded as enemies of that state.
But the point is,
actually, no, it was more complex, if I may. The Irish were totally loyal to the British and volunteered in enormous numbers, Catholics as well as Protestants. What changed, and when the Easter Rising came in 1916, it was not popular. It was only a handful of Irish idealists and extremists, as it was seen. The people of Dublin did not support it for a second. And this is even reflected in the greatest artistic achievement of that era, the plays of Sean O'Casey. But the English overplayed their hand, a familiar tale of empires, especially in their lighter time. The cruelty and viciousness with which they killed just even the handful of leaders of the Irish Rising in 1916 in Kilmainham Jail. James Connolly was already a dying man, was refused medical treatment, and was strapped up against the stake to be shot anyway. And this was widely known. And it was it was these small but striking personal outrages that transformed Irish opinion, along with the realization that for all the tens of thousands of Irishmen who died for the British Empire on the Western Front, Ireland was not going to be granted the moderate home rule within the British Empire, which was all that moderate Irish nationalists had sought before 1914 anyway. So Padraig Pearse and the leaders of the 1916 Rising made their point successfully by their deaths. But the Irish were originally as mindlessly loyal and idealistically, tragically loyal to the British as the Australians and the New Zealanders were. One last point on this. Very eminent figure in the United Nations in the 1950s and 60s, familiar to all of us, Conor Cruise O'Brien, the very eminent Irish writer, philosopher, and diplomat. And through mutual friends, I got to know him well as a dining companion in his later years in Washington. He'd become ultra-conservative and, of all things, a Northern Irish Unionist. Ireland drives everybody mad in those years. But one of his favorite stories is he had two uncles, one of whom was an Irish Republican, but also a pacifist, who was shot dead right after the Easter Rising by a psychopathic English officer in Dublin, although he was an innocent man, just because he'd taken a disliking to him. And of course, the killer was never prosecuted. But he said, that uncle of mine is remembered now as a martyr for the Irish Republic. He's a great hero of Ireland. The true tragic figure, he said, was another uncle of mine, an idealistic Irish patriot who served in the British Army as an officer, who died in the British Army in World War I, but on his last leave home after the Easter Rising in Dublin, when he came home to meet his wife, who he loved dearly, and his young children, his son and daughters were in terror, ran away screaming from him when their father came to the door, because they didn't realize at first it was the beloved father. They could only see the uniform of a British officer. And they remembered what had been done even in their own peaceful, supposedly respectable middle-class neighborhood by the British Army in crushing the 1916 Rising. So they did what the Israelis have been doing. They sowed devil's teeth for themselves.
Good stuff. So you knew Conor Cruise O'Brien. I mean, I was reading him just 2 days ago because of course he was in Katanga, and he wrote that book about the Dag Hammarskjöld. And I was attending a Zoom conference in Stockholm, so I was sitting here, but they were talking about Conor Cruise, O'Brien, because all those experts on Hammarskjöld are relying on him for the first experience. Well, anyway, have to pick your brains about that. I mean, I thought he was a fantastic stylist, but I mean, he'd use 10 words, but often one word would do. But never mind.
He was Irish. We all do. You know that. Telly.
That's right. That's right. John, so what? Russia, Ukraine. Yesterday there was a meeting of the E3 in London. And there's talk about the headline in the Russia hating British press was how that Ukraine is almost ready to fire long range missiles into Russia. So clear provocation there. People thought, are they going to appoint a peace negotiator? Alexander Stubb, the Finnish president, talked about that in a Neue Zürcher Zeitung interview. That's that. What's your take on the later? I think since we last spoke, there was a St. Petersburg economic conference, which is a kind of showcase for Putin, and foreign visitors come. Apparently, a lot of Germans came all throughout the war, and Americans even. But now the Americans had an official presence for the first time in 4 years. But of course, the Ukrainians attacked it with drones, so you had the skyline of this beautiful city sort of dominated by these clouds of exploded, was it oil refineries? So it's mostly cosmetic, mostly for propaganda. That's the setting. What's your take on the latest developments in the Ukraine war and in Russia and in Europe, the conflict there?
Well, I think we better make the context a little bit wider because of the Armenian election that occurred yesterday. Of
course, yeah.
What we face now is a repeat in Armenia of what we have had to deal with in the Ukraine since 2014. The attempts by the Russian side, and particularly President Putin, to apply soft pressure on the Armenians, and has failed totally. And it's hard to believe that the Armenian election has resulted in, roughly speaking, 50% for Pashinyan, the prime minister's party, which will result in a significant majority of seats in the Russian parliament. Sorry, the Armenian parliament. And he will push through an alliance with first the European Union and then with NATO. It's a repeat of the Ukraine scenario, against which the Russian side have supported Karapetyan, who ended up with only 23% of the vote, and Kocharyan, who ended up with 9.9%. Together, they represent the pro-Russian Armenian population. Karapetyan made a $1 billion fortune in Russia as a real estate developer, really a conduit for Armenian capital in Russia, and he's failed. It's a political failure. It's not yet being described as that in Moscow, but the consequences are that President Trump expressly endorsed Pashinyan's election. The Russian side implicitly endorsed opposition and warned the Armenians of a variety of trade cut-offs: flowers, tomatoes, cucumbers. These were all trade from Armenia was stopped prior to the election as a warning. And President Putin made a speech in Kazakhstan with the press explaining what would happen if Armenia goes the Ukrainian direction, except he didn't mention the Ukraine. And that was simply countermanded by the European Union, which offered 50 million euros in compensation for the lost exports, and indicates that we're on schedule now from a European and NATO point of view to turn Armenia into a major source of anti-Russian sentiment and security threat, as the Ukraine was. And so the question becomes in Russia, why was the Armenian election underestimated for the damage it would do? And why wasn't the one word that is very obvious? Why wasn't the Ukraine word used with respect to Armenia, in the belief that Armenian voters would see that as a future and vote against Pashinyan? Well, they didn't see it as a future. They saw the money of Pashinyan outspending and outpromising Karapetyan and Kocharyan. And that's a significant reminder of where we are in the Ukraine. So to come back to your question, we have just over the weekend had the President Putin admit that he has now deployed two oligarch representatives, one in the direction of the Trump family. We've talked about him before, Kirill Dmitriev, who represents the entire oligarch group that wants to restore business as usual with the United States, in the belief that that will mitigate the military and security threat that's coming from the United States. They don't accept that the United States is in permanent war with Russia. They don't accept what's just happened in Armenia as a reminder. They don't accept what is proposed in your neighborhood, Pele, and you've written marvelously about Sweden. I do thank you for that. The deployment of nuclear weapons in Finland, for example, would be an example of what the underlying Trump strategy is. But that's not why President Putin deploys Kirill Dmitriev in the American negotiating direction. We've learned over the weekend that President Putin deployed another oligarch, Roman Abramovich, who was sent to Kiev to negotiate with Vladimir Zelensky. And what's happened here is instructive. I've written about it today in Dances with Bears, so that everyone should understand that President Putin admitted that he had sent an honorable and trustworthy businessman to Kiev. If you look at the language, and we don't have time for me to go through the language, but go through the language of what President Putin says, and you have to ask yourself, is the president capable of learning that, first, Russian public opinion hates the oligarchs, distrusts the oligarchs? It keeps coming up in all polls. Why then would the president deploy two in each direction of the war, to Kiev on the one hand and to Washington on the other? The response from Zelensky was spelled out in an interestingly detailed account, his account on Sky News, aired in London on Sunday night, and in which Zelensky describes Abramovich as having come and trying to negotiate. President Putin has tried to minimize the degree to which that was a genuine Russian-Ukrainian negotiation. And we've been through that before. Abramovich was deeply involved and had seniority in the Istanbul negotiations back in March and April of 2022. So we are repeating the history, and one therefore has to ask, to what extent does the president and those closest to him learn the lessons of the most immediate past? And second, do they understand that Russian public opinion does not have the confidence he's just expressed in Dmitriev with Trump and in Abramovich with the Ukraine? And third, they've both failed. Dmitriev has not brought back from Trump any terms of agreement that resolve the immediate or medium-term or long-term security problem that's being fought out on the Ukrainian battlefield, and neither did Abramovich. But wasn't that predictable in the first place? So why were they sent at all? That's where we are today.
Dmitriev talked about, I mean, that was a headline, signing a memorandum of understanding about building a tunnel underneath the Bering Sea.
Yes.
Which connect. Did any of that happen? Or was it just
tunnel,
flim-flam?
The Bering Strait tunnel has been one of the projects of linking the United States in capital terms and in symbolic terms that Dmitriev has been promoting, partly to promote himself, for more than months. It's years now. To sign a memorandum of understanding is what the SPIEF, the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, that's what it does. There's been no implementation of such a scheme. But let's put it geopolitically, Pele. Why would anyone imagine that states at war are going to invest in a tunnel to connect Alaska to Russia, when everything Trump is doing is putting Alaska in the Golden Dome setup, which is strategically threatening more to Russia than we experienced in Star Wars. I mean, let's just put it clearly. Above the tunnel under the sea of the Bering Strait, there's the Golden Dome. You will never hear from Dmitriev the connection between the two. Why? Because he's promoting the notion that Trump can be trusted. He's promoting the notion that the Anchorage formula, that's the purported terms of agreement reached between President Putin and Trump back in August of last year, is still a viable framework for money. So basically, Dmitriev's waving money bags, or actually they're promises of money bags, in which he would derive a personal profit, and his constituency would aim to make a corporate profit, not to mention the recovery of their U.S. assets, their homes, ski lodges in Colorado, their homes in Upper East Side Manhattan, and in Washington, all of the, and in Florida. This is a fantasy. And to understand how much of a fantasy the Bering Strait is, all you have to do is look up in the air where Trump is building the Golden Dome.
Martin, yeah.
Fully agree with you, John. Bless you, a masterful analysis again. And of course, as usual, when you and Pele talk about the grand geostrategic issues, I relate it to tiny Irish, but I believe relevant precedents. And that is the Trump idea of this wonderful tunnel. Certainly has great emotional part to it. My late friend, who died just a year and a half or so ago, Professor Edward Lozansky, who was one of the towering figures for sanity and restoring of amity and mutual respect even between Russia and the United States for decades. And it cost him in career and prestige terms enormously. But he had been the friend and disciple of Andrei Sakharov, and he was true to his friend in his own figure, figure of the greatest stature. And he supported this project to build amity and concord between the United States and Russia. But having said that, it's absurd, because there is no economic basis for it whatsoever. If you look at the channel, the channel tunnel between England and France, which old British imperial, aging, dying extinct dinosaur loyalists opposed bitterly for hundreds of years, it proved to be an enormous boon to the economies of Europe and Britain alike, because it's a simple tunnel, not too far under the sea, not at too great a depth. It's only a 20 to 30 minute mile journey. Fast trains and cars go through it every day. It does marvelous business. It's between major population centers. It makes demographic sense. It makes economic sense. But Boris Johnson, the Donald Trump of his day in Britain, the great phony stunt artist, urged a bridge of all things, which was simply ludicrous, or a tunnel, which, given the depth of the Irish Sea, which is enormously deep between Northern Ireland and Scotland, to link Scotland and Ireland. And I was amazed to discover how much credibility this had among the supposedly hard-headed peoples of Northern Ireland and Southwest Scotland alike. None of them looked at the practicality of it. Again, it was a technological nightmare. That was an impossibility. And even if you could build it, almost nobody would take it. A bridge was totally insane, given the weather conditions, which are notoriously bad over the Irish Sea and the North Channel. The engineering challenges are almost as insane for a tunnel. But most of all, you didn't have the population or investment or potential markets in Ireland or in Southwest Scotland, one of the least developed parts of Scotland, to justify either of them. And the idea of this ridiculous tunnel or bridge or whatever it's going to be over the Bering Strait is equally absurd. So it's another pipe dream.
Well, it's 5,000 kilometers.
Boris Johnson should have been limited to selling bad, used, old Ford, broken, old, not even Ford cars. I won't slander Ford, but broken old British Leyland cars in the British market. And you can easily see what was the president. The president was a very successful booster of real estate projects, some of them brilliant, some of them highly dubious, in the northeastern United States. And that's all this is. It's just another big balloon boost. So again, thank you for pouring cold water and your usual cleansing sanity on this, John.
Uh, Sorry, John, we've got 4 minutes left. I just wanted to return before we go to the Armenian election. I mean, we're used to hearing that the Georgians were very prudent. The EU tried to do a color revolution of sorts there a couple of
Yes.
years ago. Why is Armenia less prudent than Georgia?
Pardon me. Well, Armenia is much more vulnerable. It has lost a war against Azerbaijan and lost Nagorno-Karabakh, which was a disputed territory that Armenia and Azerbaijan have fought over since the breakup of the Soviet Union. And there have been terrible pogroms on each side, Azeris against Armenians, Armenians against Azeris, since the breakdown of Soviet control between the two populations. But Azerbaijan, with backing from the United States and Turkey, has managed to dominate Armenia and win the last military round, so that Pashinyan has also survived the reputation of having lost Nagorno-Karabakh, which has been ethnically cleansed and the Armenian populations forced back into Armenian mainland. I'm not, it's been a long time since I was in Azerbaijan. I used to have good Armenian community connections in Moscow. But let me warn you, the Armenian politics, like Azeri politics, are very particular, very deep, and very complicated, and covered with money, and covered with criminal money, that makes it very difficult to understand who's buying what kinds of loyalty. Basically, Armenia under Pashinyan has been persuaded by the EU and NATO that it will be in his interest and the interest of his constituencies to take European money and NATO money and move Armenia out of the Russian sphere of influence. And Trump is fully behind that and is building, or aims to build, a corridor, a land corridor, not a tunnel and not a bridge, which he's named after himself, pardon me, across the southern Armenian, Azeri, and Iranian border at a place called, or in an area called the Zangezur corridor. So the US is intent on transforming the Caucasus, much as they're intent to topple the Iran regime and change the entire southern front for Russia into a US protectorate. And that's, Armenia's bought it.
John and Martin, we're going to end there, but it basically summarized that what you've said, John, is that, Putin and the oligarchs seem completely delusional about Trump, because Trump is as tough or as hard on the Russians as anyone else. And he's completely, and he might introduce a second front, basically. We've got a third front in the Baltics with Finland, which I've studied. And now we've got Armenia plus Ukraine. And it seems that this conflict is going to go on for a long time yet, because even if we were to solve Ukraine, we'd still have Armenia. Well, John, you must come on very soon again to discuss this. Thanks for bringing that to our attention. I've followed a little bit, but not with the same level of detail that you were able to provide there. So thank you, both of you, gentlemen, and have a fantastic rest of day. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.